The lake behind my house had always been a sanctuary, a quiet retreat where the world melted away with the rippling water and the whisper of the wind through the trees. I had lived on this property for years, and every evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of amber and crimson, I would take my old fishing rod and settle by the shore, letting the weight of the day slip off my shoulders with each gentle cast into the glassy surface. It was a ritual as old as time itself, a simple pleasure that grounded me in ways few things could. That evening was no different. The summer air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and the cicadas hummed their lazy chorus in the distance as I threaded a hook through a fat, wriggling worm. The lake was calm, its waters reflecting the sky like a perfect mirror. I exhaled, savoring the moment, the quiet, the sense of solitude. But just as I was about to cast my line, a voice sliced through the serenity like a blade. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I turned, startled by the sharpness of the tone, and saw her standing a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, her whole body radiating disapproval. She was a woman in her 50s, with short, bleached blonde hair cut into a severe bob, wearing a faded t-shirt emblazoned with the words "Meat is murder" in bold, aggressive lettering. Her lips were pursed so tightly they were almost white, and the way she stared at me, like I had just committed some unforgivable crime, sent an immediate wave of irritation through me. I sighed, already weary of whatever was about to unfold. "I'm fishing," I said simply, gesturing toward my rod as if it wasn't already obvious. She took a step closer, her sneakers crunching against the dry grass. "You're killing," she snapped. "Do you even understand what you're doing? Those fish feel pain. They have families, they have lives, and you're just yanking them out of the water for fun." I blinked, caught off guard by the sheer intensity of her accusation. "Lady, this is my lake," I said slowly, deliberately. "On my property. I've been fishing here for years. I'm not running some kind of mass slaughterhouse. I'm catching a couple of fish for dinner. It's not that deep." Her face twisted into something between disgust and fury, her fingers twitching as though she wanted to reach out and physically stop me. "Not that deep?" she echoed, voice rising. "So, you think it's just fine to impale an innocent creature on a hook? Drag it gasping out of the water and then what, snap its neck? Chop it up? Eat it like some kind of savage?" A slow, simmering anger began to bubble in my chest, but I forced myself to keep my voice even. "That's how fishing works," I said flatly, "and unless you're planning on living off grass and sunlight, I'd say we're all part of the food chain in one way or another." She let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head like she couldn't believe she was having this conversation. "Oh, typical," she spat. "Typical selfish, barbaric behavior. Do you even realize what kind of suffering you're causing? Have you ever thought about what those poor animals go through? Or are you just too numb to care?" At this point, I was done entertaining whatever moral crusade she was on. I turned back toward the lake, ready to ignore her entirely, but before I could cast my line, she stomped forward, actually reaching out to grab my fishing rod. I yanked it back instinctively, taking a step away. "Are you serious right now?" I snapped, my patience wearing dangerously thin. "You're trespassing, harassing me on my own property, and now you think you have the right to touch my stuff? Lady, back the hell off." Her nostrils flared, and for a split second, I thought she might actually try something. Instead, she jabbed a shaking finger toward me, her voice trembling with righteous fury. "I swear to God, if you don't stop this, if you don't put that rod down right now, I will call the police. You're committing an act of cruelty, and I will make sure you face consequences for it." I stared at her, incredulous. "You're going to call the cops?" I repeated deadpan. "Because I'm fishing. On my own land." "Yes," she hissed. "Because what you're doing is disgusting and inhumane. And if the authorities won't stop you, I will." There was something in the way she said it that made a cold thread of unease curl in my stomach. It wasn't just the usual self-righteous indignation of a zealot. There was something else there, something darker, more unhinged. I had dealt with pushy vegans before, hell, I'd even gotten into debates with a few. But this woman wasn't just arguing ethics. She was threatening, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep my composure. "Look," I said, my voice measured. "I'm not looking for trouble. You don't like what I do? Fine. But this is my property, and you have no right to be here, let alone try to tell me what I can and can't do. So why don't you turn around and walk back to wherever the hell you came from before I'm the one calling the cops?" For a moment, she just stood there, breathing hard, her chest rising and falling like a bellows. Her fingers twitched at her sides, and her eyes darted to my fishing rod like she was considering whether or not to make another grab for it. Then, with a sharp, furious breath, she spun on her heel and stormed away, muttering something under her breath that I couldn't quite catch. I watched her retreat until she disappeared into the tree line, my muscles still taut with tension. The encounter had left a sour taste in my mouth, a creeping unease that I couldn't quite shake. I had dealt with nosy neighbors before, but something about this woman, her intensity, her willingness to escalate so quickly, felt different. I shook my head, exhaling slowly. Maybe she'd cool off and never bother me again. Maybe this was just one of those weird run-ins that happened every now and then. Still, as I turned back to the water and cast my line, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Something told me this wasn't over. The days that followed my encounter with Karen should have been uneventful, should have returned to the quiet routine I had always enjoyed. But instead, a strange tension settled over my home, an invisible weight pressing down on my chest every time I stepped outside. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. One encounter with an overly aggressive animal rights activist wasn't enough to warrant the unease that crawled up my spine whenever I walked toward the lake. But then I saw her again, and I knew I had been right to worry. It started subtly at first, just the sensation of being watched, the awareness of something lingering just beyond the edge of my vision. The first time, it was in the middle of the afternoon, the sun warm against my back as I set up my fishing gear, the familiar smell of the water filling my lungs. As I prepared to cast my line, I felt it, that prickling sensation, the undeniable presence of eyes on me. I turned my head sharply, scanning the tree line, and there she was. Karen stood just beyond the border of my property, partially obscured by the thick brush, but not enough to hide the phone clutched in her hand, its camera pointed directly at me. Her face was blank, eerily still, but her posture was stiff with tension, her grip on the device white-knuckled. I exhaled slowly, deliberately, forcing my pulse to steady. "You again?" I muttered, shaking my head as I turned my attention back to the lake. The air remained thick with unspoken hostility, but she said nothing. She just stood there, filming, recording me like I was some kind of criminal, and even though I wanted to ignore her, to pretend she didn't exist, I could feel the slow, creeping rise of anger bubbling beneath my skin. This happened again and again. Every time I went to the lake, she was there. Sometimes at a distance, sometimes closer, but always watching, always filming, always radiating that same quiet, burning fury. At first, I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that she would get bored and move on. But as the days passed, she only seemed to become more emboldened. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the first hints of night crept into the sky, I was hauling my gear back toward the house when I heard her voice, sharp and accusing, cutting through the stillness. "How does it feel?" she demanded. I turned to find her standing a few yards away, her phone still raised, but this time her expression was twisted with something more than just disapproval. Something raw, something bordering on hatred. I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my jaw. "How does what feel? Knowing that you're a murderer," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "Knowing that you rip innocent creatures from their homes, steal their last breaths, all for your own selfish pleasure." I let out a dry, humorless chuckle, shaking my head. "Lady, you're insane." Her lips curled into a sneer, and for the first time, she lowered the phone. "You think this is funny? You think this is just some kind of joke? You're disgusting. People like you take and take and take, and you never stop to think about the suffering you cause. You're pathetic." I clenched my jaw, forcing down the urge to snap back, to engage, to give her exactly what she wanted. Instead, I turned away, muttering under my breath as I strode back toward the house, refusing to let her sink her claws into me any deeper. But Karen wasn't finished. That night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, something woke me. A sound, faint but persistent, like the rustling of leaves against the window pane. I blinked into the darkness, my heart thudding in my chest as I sat up, straining to listen. At first, I thought it was just the wind, just the natural creaks and groans of an old house settling into the night. But then there was a sharp tap 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 against the glass. Deliberate and precise, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, muscles coiled with unease as I padded toward the window, heart pounding against my ribs. Slowly, cautiously, I peeled back the curtain and froze. The porch light illuminated the yard just enough for me to see the ground below, and what I saw sent a cold chill racing down my spine. Scattered across my lawn, glinting under the dim glow, were dozens of papers, each one printed with grotesque, gory images. Fish torn apart, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes vacant, their bodies mangled beyond recognition. My stomach twisted, revulsion rising in my throat as I turned my gaze toward the tree line, half expecting to see her standing there, watching, waiting, reveling in my reaction. But the woods were empty, still eerily silent. I clenched my fists, my pulse a dull roar in my ears. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fresh water as I cast my line into the lake, the rhythmic lapping of the waves against the shore settling into the quiet symphony of dusk. The setting sun painted streaks of burnt orange across the sky, and for a moment, despite everything, I felt a semblance of peace return. The past few days had been a relentless storm of paranoia, of catching glimpses of Karen at the edge of my property, of finding unsettling messages. Letters scrawled in red ink reading murderer pinned to my door, dead fish arranged in grotesque patterns near my porch, as if she were trying to send some twisted message. But I refused to let her dictate my life. I refused to let fear settle into my bones. So I fished. The reel hummed as I pulled the line in, the weight of a catch tugging against my grip. But just as I was about to lift the fish from the water, a voice, sharp, trembling with rage, cut through the silence. "Drop it!" I froze. Slowly, I turned my head, my pulse slamming against my ribs. Karen stood a few yards away, her stance rigid, her breathing shallow. The usual wildness in her eyes was still there, but this time, there was something else lurking beneath it. Something darker, something final. My gaze flickered downward, and that was when I saw it. A gun. She clutched the pistol in both hands, her knuckles white, her fingers twitching against the grip like she could barely control the energy surging through her. The sight of it sent a jolt of cold panic through me, but I kept my expression steady, my voice measured. "Karen," I said, my hand still gripping my fishing rod, my mind racing. "What the hell are you doing?" Her lips curled back, and her voice cracked with the weight of her fury. "I told you," she seethed, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. "I told you to stop. I told you what you're doing is wrong. And you just ignored me. You laughed at me." I exhaled slowly, carefully shifting my stance, trying to assess just how far gone she was. I had dealt with my fair share of unhinged people before, but this was different. This was a woman on the edge of something irreversible. "Karen," I said again, keeping my voice calm, steady, "you don't want to do this." Her grip on the gun tightened, and for a second, I swore I saw her hands tremble. "Don't tell me what I want," she spat. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? You think you can just keep killing, keep destroying lives, and nothing will happen to you." I let out a slow breath, suppressing the urge to roll my shoulders, to shift, to do anything that might set her off. "Karen, you're pointing a loaded gun at me because I'm fishing. Do you hear how crazy that sounds?" Something flickered in her expression, hesitation, doubt, but it disappeared as quickly as it came, swallowed by the weight of her conviction. "You're a murderer," she hissed, "and murderers deserve justice." I took a small step forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Put the gun down." She flinched, her finger twitching against the trigger, and for a brief moment, The fear in her eyes almost mirrored my own. But then, as if realizing she had backed herself into a corner, her expression twisted into something more desperate, more dangerous. "You're not listening?" she snarled, voice breaking. And before I could move, before I could even register what was happening, bang! The world lurched. Pain exploded in my shoulder, searing and white-hot. And before I even processed that I had been shot, my legs gave out beneath me, sending me sprawling onto the damp earth. The fishing rod slipped from my fingers, forgotten, as agony tore through me, pulsing in rhythmic waves. I gasped, my vision blurring, my hands instinctively flying to my shoulder where the bullet had torn through flesh. Warmth seeped between my fingers, blood, hot and sticky, soaking into my shirt. Karen stood above me, the gun still clutched in her trembling hands, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with something that looked an awful lot like shock, as if she hadn't quite believed she would pull the trigger until she had. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to breathe through the pain, to push past the wave of dizziness threatening to pull me under. "Jesus Christ," I ground out, my voice raw with disbelief. "You shot me." Karen blinked, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find the words to justify what she had just done. The righteous fury that had fueled her moments ago flickered, dimming into something more fragile, more uncertain. I had to," she stammered, but the conviction in her voice wavered. You wouldn't stop. You wouldn't listen. I warned you." I let out a bitter, breathless laugh, wincing as the movement sent another bolt of pain through my body. "You warned me," I echoed, my breathing ragged. "So, what? This was your idea of justice?" Her hands shook, the barrel of the gun lowering slightly, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I saw it. The realization sinking into her, the horror creeping up her spine. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She had fired a gun at a man over a goddamn fish. The silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of what she had done. And then, without a word, without even a glance back, she turned and ran. I watched her retreating figure disappear into the woods, my pulse thundering in my ears, my body trembling with adrenaline and pain. My vision swam, my limbs heavy, my breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. I knew I had to move, had to stop the bleeding, had to get help, but all I could do in that moment was lie there, staring up at the sky, the last remnants of daylight fading into darkness, and wonder how the hell things had come to this. The pain was sharp, a searing burn that radiated from my shoulder down to my fingertips, each breath sending fresh waves of agony through my body as I struggled to stay conscious. The world around me swayed, the dark silhouettes of trees bending and shifting against the deepening dusk, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint rustling of leaves as Karen disappeared into the woods. She had shot me over a goddamn fish, and now she was running, her footsteps growing fainter by the second, swallowed by the vast wilderness beyond my land. I gritted my teeth, pressing my hand tighter against the wound, feeling the slick warmth of my own blood seeping through my fingers. The bullet had gone straight through. I could tell from the exit wound burning like fire on the other side. But that was little consolation when I was alone, bleeding out by the lake with no one to help me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision swimming in and out of focus as I tried to gather my strength. I needed to move. I needed to get to my truck. With a grunt of pain, I rolled onto my side, biting back a curse as my wounded arm protested violently, and began the agonizing process of pulling myself up. The world spun as I staggered to my feet, each step toward my truck a battle against the black spots creeping into the edges of my vision. Every movement sent fresh bursts of fire through my shoulder, but I forced myself forward, stumbling up the small hill toward the gravel driveway where my truck sat waiting. The keys. Where the hell were my keys? My thoughts were sluggish, weighed down by blood loss and adrenaline. But then I saw them, still dangling from my belt loop, and with a shaking hand, I yanked them free. The truck door groaned as I pulled it open, and I half fell into the driver's seat, my good hand fumbling to jam the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I pressed my foot down hard on the gas, gravel spraying as I lurched forward, speeding toward town, toward help, toward the only thing that might keep me from passing out on the side of the road and bleeding to death alone. The drive was a blur. Flashes of headlights, the dull hum of the radio barely registering beneath the pounding in my ears. The pain was unbearable now, a raw and relentless fire consuming my entire left side, and I had to fight to keep my vision from tunneling. My phone was in the cup holder, but I didn't dare reach for it, not when I was barely holding on to consciousness as it was. By the time I reached the hospital, my body was slick with cold sweat, my hands trembling so violently that I could barely shift into park. I don't even remember getting out of the truck, only the blinding fluorescent lights, the sharp intake of breath from a nurse as she caught sight of me stumbling through the entrance, and then the sensation of hands grabbing me, guiding me, voices shouting something I couldn't quite comprehend before everything faded into darkness. I woke to the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, the sterile scent of antiseptic filling my nostrils. My throat was dry, my body heavy, and when I tried to move, pain flared through my shoulder so sharply that I had to clamp my teeth together to keep from groaning out loud. That was the first thought that registered, followed closely by the memory of Karen. The gun, the look in her eyes right before she pulled the trigger, the way she had fled without a second glance. The anger hit me like a freight train, raw and seething beneath my skin, but before I could dwell on it, the sound of a door opening pulled my attention. A cop stepped inside, middle-aged, stocky, with a tired expression that told me he had seen far too much in his years on the force. He nodded toward me, his gaze assessing. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. I let out a slow, shaky breath. "Tell me you got her," he sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "We did. Found her about a mile from your property, hiding in a shed like some rabid animal. She didn't even try to deny what she did. Kept ranting about justice for the fish and how you deserved what happened to you. She's in custody now." He paused, studying me. "And with your testimony, she won't be seeing daylight for a long time." A bitter laugh bubbled up in my throat, but it died just as quickly. There was nothing funny about any of this. Nothing about the fact that a woman had convinced herself that shooting a man over a fishing rod was justified. The pain in my shoulder was nothing compared to the realization that people like Karen didn't see themselves as villains. They believed, wholeheartedly, that they were the heroes. The cop must have seen something in my expression because he sighed again, shaking his head. People like her, they get so wrapped up in their own righteousness they don't even see the damage they cause. It's like they think they're the only ones who matter. I exhaled slowly, staring at the ceiling. "Yeah," I muttered. I noticed. A silence stretched between us before the cop finally stood, tipping his head toward me. "Get some rest. You'll need it." As he walked out, I let my eyes drift shut, exhaustion settling deep into my bones. I should have felt relieved, knowing she was behind bars, knowing I had survived. But all I felt was a dull, lingering unease, a quiet understanding that there were more Karens out there. More people who would justify violence in the name of whatever cause they had twisted into their personal crusade. And that thought was far more terrifying than any bullet wound. And that's my story. If you think what happened to me was insane, let me know in the comments below. Have you ever had a run-in with a Karen like this? What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more crazy real-life stories. Trust me, there's no shortage of them.